Eloin had not planned on standing between the Alpha King and total carnage. But here she was frozen in the doorway of the great hall, with a basket of dried chamomile clutched against her ribs, while the most powerful wolf in the realm crouched 6 feet away, with golden eyes that held no trace of the man inside them. The hall had emptied in seconds. Chairs lay overturned. The long oak table had been shoved sideways. Goblets and documents scattered across the stone floor like debris from a storm. Deep claw marks scored the wood in long, savage grooves, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of fear and a wilder scent underneath, feral and raw, that made the animal part of her brain scream to run. No one had warned her. She had been crossing through the corridor on her way to the storeroom when the screaming started. A guard had shoved past her, white-faced and running, then a second, then a third. And because Eloin was alone, because she had never once in her 22 years possessed the good sense to run away from danger, she had turned toward the noise instead of away from it. Now she was regretting that decision with every fiber of her being. The wolf that wore King Calem's face was enormous. His shift was incomplete, caught somewhere between man and beast in a way that should not have been possible. His hands had twisted into claws, each one as long as her finger, black and curved and gleaming in the pale light. His spine was curved at an angle that made her own back ache, just looking at it. The bones of his jaw had started to elongate, his teeth too long, too sharp, pressing against lips that were pulled back in a snarl that vibrated through the stone beneath her feet and settled somewhere deep behind her ribs. He was looking directly at her. Eloin stopped breathing. The chamomile in her basket smelled sweet and faintly dusty, and she was suddenly absurdly aware that it might be the last thing she ever smelled. Her wolf, small and quiet and unremarkable, flattened itself inside her like a creature trying to make itself invisible, his golden eyes locked onto her hair. She knew because she watched his gaze track upward, away from her face, fixing on the long crimson braid that hung over her shoulder like a rope of dark fire. Something shifted in those terrible golden eyes. Not recognition. Something older, something instinctive and vast and beyond any word she had for it. The snarl died. The vibration beneath her feet ceased. The claws that had been gouging stone retracted slowly, one joint at a time, until human fingers lay flat against the floor. The impossible angle of his spine straightened, vertebra by vertebra, and the elongated jaw compressed back into a face she recognized from a distance, but had never seen this close. King Calem knelt on the ruined floor of his great hall, chest heaving, sweat rolling down his temples, his dark eyes blinking rapidly as if surfacing from deep water. Human eyes. The gold was gone. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them like a wire, pulled taut somewhere behind her. She heard footsteps. Careful, measured, deliberate. Corwin, the king's beta, appeared at the edge of her vision and stopped, dead. She sensed him taking in the scene, the wrecked hall, the king on his knees, the nobody herbalist standing untouched in the doorway with a basket of dried flowers and a face the color of chalk. "What did you do?" Corwin's voice was barely above a whisper. "Nothing," Eloin said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, thin and far away. "I just walked in." The beta was quiet for a very long moment. She could practically hear him thinking. Calem braced his palms against the stone and pushed himself upright. The movement was slow, unsteady, like a man who had just been dragged back from some terrible edge and was not entirely sure the ground beneath him was real. He swayed once, caught himself, and when his gaze found Eloin again, there was an emotion in it she could not name. Confusion, perhaps, or an intensity that looked almost like hunger. "Everyone out," the king said. His voice was raw, scraped hollow, the voice of a man who had been screaming from a place no one could reach. Corwin gestured sharply. The few remaining guards and attendants, who had crept back to the doorway, scattered like startled birds. But when Eloin turned to follow them, the beta caught her arm. "Not you," he murmured. Stay, she stared at him with wide eyes. I would very much like to leave. I understand, Corwin said, his grip gentle but unmovable. Stay anyway. The king had turned away from them both. He stood facing the tall arched windows where pale afternoon light fell in long columns across the destruction he had caused. His hands hung at his sides, and she could see they were still trembling. She noticed blood on his knuckles, his own, and the sight of it made her stomach twist. Aloan stood in the ruined hall and waited. Minutes passed, heavy and suffocating. She counted the claw marks on the table because it gave her something to do that was not looking at the king. 7 deep gouges, each one longer than her forearm. Each one proof that the man standing by the window could have torn her apart without effort. But he had not. He had stopped. The moment she walked through that door, something in him had stopped. Your name, Calum said without turning around. She flinched at the sound of his voice. Aloan? Your Majesty? Aloan? He repeated it like he was testing the shape of it, turning it over in his mouth the way someone might examine a stone found in an unexpected place. You work in the infirmary? The herbalist's quarters, Your Majesty? Under Mistress Marin? Another long silence. She watched his reflection in the window glass, ghost pale and wavering. You may go, he said. Still not turning. Still facing the window like it was the only thing keeping him standing. Aloan did not need to be told twice. She turned and walked out of the hall on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She made it to the end of the corridor before Corwin caught up with her. What you saw in there, the beta said, falling into step beside her. I saw nothing, Eloan said quickly. Absolutely nothing. Happened. I was never here. I don't even know where the Great Hall is. What Great Hall? Corwin studied her for a moment. A flicker of what might have been approval crossed his face before disappearing behind his usual composure. Good, he said. Don't leave the grounds tonight. I may need to find you. Why? Aloan asked, her voice climbing. Is the king angry with me? The beta paused. No, he said slowly. I don't believe he is. Then why do you look so worried? Corwin did not answer that question. Stay in your quarters tonight. Don't tell anyone what happened. I will come to you in the morning. He left her standing in the corridor with her basket of chamomile and a heartbeat that refused to slow down. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw golden irises tracking the crimson of her hair with that ancient, unreadable intensity. She dreamed that the wolf followed her through the palace, silent and enormous, its breath warm against the back of her neck. In the dream, she was not afraid. That was somehow worse. She woke before dawn to a knock on her door. A guard stood in the dim corridor, his expression carefully neutral. You are summoned, he said. The beta requests your presence immediately. Eloan's stomach dropped through the floor. The room Corwin brought her to was small and sparse, tucked away in the administrative wing of the palace where the air smelled of ink and old parchment. 2 chairs faced each other across a narrow desk. The beta gestured for her to sit, and she did, gripping her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. Before I explain, Corwin began, settling into the opposite chair, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to delivering difficult information. I need your word that what I tell you does not leave this room. Aloan swallowed. You have it. Corwin studied her for a moment, his dark eyes weighing a question she could not hear. Then he leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a register that made the walls feel closer. The king is cursed. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Aloan blinked at him, waiting for the rest, the reassurance, the explanation that would make those 3 words less catastrophic. None came. Cursed, she repeated. 2 years ago, the king led a campaign against a rogue pack called the Ashen Maw. Their alpha, Baldric, had been raiding border settlements for over a year, burning villages, slaughtering civilians who had no part in any territorial dispute. Women, children, the old and the sick. Corwin's voice was even controlled, like he was reading from a report. But his jaw was tight and the muscles in his forearms were corded. Diplomacy failed. 3 separate peace envoys were sent. Valdric sent the third one back dead. The king went to war because there was nothing else left to do. Eowyn felt cold despite the fire crackling in the grate behind her. The war ended at the siege of Grimark. Baldric was killed, but his consort, a blood witch named Sereth, cursed the king before she died. She used her own blood to bind the spell. She bound his wolf with old magic, the kind that roots itself in bone and marrow and cannot be cut out. The curse severs the tether between the king's human mind and his wolf. Slowly, over time, the wolf consumes the man. Eowyn's nails dug into her palms. What happens when the tether breaks completely? He loses himself permanently. The wolf takes over, no humanity, no reason, no control, just a feral beast trapped in the body of the realm's strongest alpha. Corwin's voice didn't waver, but something in his eyes did. He would have to be put down like an animal. The word hit her like a physical blow. "How much time does he have?" she asked. "We thought 6 months." Corwin paused, and the pause was its own kind of answer. That estimate was made 4 months ago. The episodes are increasing in frequency and severity. Yesterday's was the worst, yet 3 guards were injured before his wolf retreated. "And no one can help him?" Eowyn asked. "What about healers, witches, scholars?" "Every remedy has been tried," Corwin said. "Mistress Meryn has exhausted her knowledge. We brought in specialists from 3 territories, herbalists, wolf singers, even a witch from the northern borderlands who claims she could unravel blood magic. Nothing works. Nothing even slows it down." He leaned back and his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse jump. Until yesterday, the silence that followed bore down on her eardrums. You walked into that hall and his wolf stopped, not retreated. Not fought its way back under the king's control. The way it usually does, it stopped, surrendered. In 2 years, nothing has pulled him back from the edge like that. Nothing has even come close. Eowyn shook her head. "That can't be because of me." "I didn't do anything. I was just standing there holding chamomile." "I know," Corwin said. "Which is why I need you to do it again." She stared at him. "You want me to walk into a room with the king while he's losing control of his wolf and just stand there?" "Not exactly. I want to test your effect on him during a controlled situation. He won't be in an episode. He'll be working in his study. I want you to sit in the room, and I want to see what happens. And if nothing happens, then we've lost nothing." Corwin's expression softened slightly. "But if something does happen, you could be the only thing standing between the king and a death sentence." The walk to the king's study felt like the longest of her life. Corwin led her through corridors she had never entered, past carved doors and silk-draped walls that belonged to a world so far above hers, she could barely comprehend it. She was a foundling, a girl left on the healer's doorstep as an infant with nothing but a wool blanket and a head of hair so red it looked like it had been dipped in blood. She had grown up in the margins of the palace, useful but invisible, the girl who ground herbs and mixed poultices and kept her head down. She did not belong in the king's private wing. Corwin stopped at a heavy door and knocked twice. A muffled voice from inside said something she could not make out. The beta pushed the door open. King Calum sat behind a wide desk covered in maps and correspondence. He did not look up when they entered. His pen moved across a document with deliberate strokes, each one precisely controlled. Eowyn noticed his knuckles were white around the pen, the only sign that the control was costing him. "Sit there," Corwin murmured, guiding her to a chair along the far wall. "Be still." She sat, the chair creaked beneath her weight, and she winced. But the king gave no indication he had heard. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to breathe quietly, tried not to notice the breadth of his shoulders, or the sharp line of his jaw, or the way the afternoon light caught the dark hair at his temple, where a single thread of silver ran through it. Minutes passed. The fire crackled in the grate. The king turned a page, read, made a note in the margin. His posture was rigid, every line of his body drawn taut like a bowstring. 10 minutes. 15. Eloan watched the clock on the mantel and counted the seconds between each tick, because she needed something to anchor her thoughts. Then she saw it. His pen slowed. The strokes became less precise. The pressure lighter. His shoulders, which had been locked in a straight line since she entered the room, dropped a fraction of an inch. She held her breath. 5 more minutes, and the pen stilled entirely. His hand rested on the page, motionless. His head dipped forward, caught itself, dipped again. As Owen watched, transfixed, as the king set his pen down with exaggerated care, folded his arms on the desk, and lowered his head onto them. His breathing deepened. His shoulders went slack. The coiled tension that radiated from him like heat from a forge simply vanished. He was asleep. Eloan turned to look at Corwin. The beta stood by the door, utterly still, his eyes fixed on the king with an expression that made her throat tighten. She had never seen raw relief on a man's face before, and the intensity of it on Corwin's made her throat tighten. This was not a subordinate watching his commander rest. This was a friend, watching someone he loved stop suffering, even if only for a moment. He held up his hand, palm out. "Stay." She stayed. An hour passed. Then 2. The king slept as though he had forgotten what rest felt like, deep and complete and undisturbed. Eloan did not move. Her back ached. Her legs went numb. She stared at a water stain on the ceiling and tried not to think about the fact that somehow, impossibly, she was the reason the Alpha King was sleeping, for what might be the first time in months. When Corwin finally gestured her toward the door, she rose on stiff legs and slipped out as quietly as she could. The beta followed her into the corridor and pulled the door shut, with barely a sound. "He's been asleep for 2 hours and 14 minutes, Corwin said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Is that unusual?" Eloan asked, already knowing the answer. "The longest he's managed in 4 months is 11 minutes. The beta's eyes were bright, and she realized with a start that he was close to tears. "You did that. I didn't do anything." "Exactly," Corwin said, and the word carried a weight she did not fully understand. "Which is why we need you to keep doing it." Eloan opened her mouth to protest, to say that she was just an herbalist, that this made no sense, that someone had clearly made a mistake. But Corwin was already walking away, and his last words drifted back to her down the corridor like a sentence she could not escape. "Be at the king's private chambers at sundown. Bring whatever you need for the night." Eloan stood alone in the empty hallway, her pulse hammering, and thought very seriously about running. She did not run. She considered it thoroughly, weighed the pros and cons during her entire walk back to the herbalist's quarters, and ultimately decided that fleeing the palace would involve crossing the outer wall, which had guards, and then navigating the Ashwood forest at night, which had wolves that were not polite enough to fall asleep in her presence. So instead, she packed a small bag with shaking hands and told Marin everything. The head healer listened without interruption, her weathered hands continuing to sort dried yarrow on the workbench while Eloan spoke. Marin was a woman who had survived 3 kings and 2 wars. A woman built of patience and sharp observation who could diagnose a fever from across the room. Very little rattled her. But when Eloan finished, the older woman's hands went still. "Say that again," Marin said. "The part about him sleeping. 2 hours and 14 minutes. Corwin timed it. Marin set down the yarrow and turned to face her fully. "Child, do you understand what that means? It means the king took a nap while I sat in a chair. It means the curse did not fight back." Marin's voice had taken on a sharp edge that Eloan had only heard when something medically significant was happening. The curse is designed to keep the wolf in a constant state of agitation. It feeds on stress, on wakefulness, on the body's inability to rest. Every remedy we have tried has been overpowered within minutes. The curse adapts. It finds a way through. It is relentless. She stepped closer, studying Eloan's face, like she was searching for something she had missed in all the years she had raised this girl. But it did not adapt to you 2 hours, Eloan. That is not a temporary reprieve. That is suppression. Something about your presence overrides the curse entirely. Eloan felt the weight of that word settle across her shoulders like a yoke. So what does that mean for me? It means the beta is right to put you near the king. Marin hesitated, and the hesitation itself was alarming, because Marin never hesitated. But it also means something is different about you, something the curse cannot overcome. And until we understand what that something is, I need you to be very, very careful. I'm not different, Eloan said, the denial automatic and well-practiced. She had spent her entire life being not different, being no one, being the quiet girl with the loud hair who kept her head down and made herself useful. I'm just me. Marin gave her a look that suggested she disagreed profoundly, but was choosing not to argue. Go. Do what the beta asks. And whatever you do, do not let that wolf get too close to you. Define too close, Eloan said weakly. Marin did not smile. If you feel something pull at you, something that doesn't feel like your own thoughts, you come to me immediately. Do you understand? Eloan nodded, unease coiling in her stomach, and left without asking what that meant. She was afraid of the answer. The walk to the king's chambers felt longer than any distance Eloan had ever crossed. Each step took her further from the world she knew, the herbalist's quarters, with their familiar smells of dried lavender and crushed root, the narrow cot she had slept in since childhood, the quiet invisible life she had built for herself in the margins of the palace. Each step took her closer to a world she did not belong in. The guard at the door let her pass without a word. She stepped inside and stopped. The king's chambers were vast high ceilings arched overhead supported by dark timber beams. A fire burned in a stone hearth, large enough for her to stand inside. The flames threw shifting patterns across stone walls hung with tapestries depicting hunts and battles. Weapons lined the walls with care and precision. Swords, a long bow, a shield bearing the royal crest, and in the center of the room, unavoidable, the bed. It was enormous, a dark frame with heavy curtains pulled back, and sheets that looked softer than anything she had ever touched. The sight of it made her mouth go dry for reasons she refused to examine. At the far end of the room, a narrow cot had been set up against the wall. Thin mattress, single blanket, flat pillow, servants' quarters. Within the king's quarters. The message was clear. She was here to serve a function, not to be comfortable. Eloan set her back on the cot and sat down, running her palms along the rough wool blanket. This she understood. Small spaces, thin pillows, the edges of rooms. She had lived her entire life on the margins, and there was a strange comfort in finding the margins even here. The door opened, and Calum walked in. He moved like a man carrying an invisible weight, a burden pressing down on every joint and sinew. His shoulders were set, his jaw locked, his dark eyes fixed straight ahead. He crossed to the desk by the window without acknowledging her, pulled out the chair, and sat. For several minutes the only sounds were the scratch of his pen and the crackle of the fire. I won't bother you, Eloan said, because the silence was becoming unbearable and she had never been good at keeping quiet. Silence for her was not restful. It was a vacuum that demanded to be filled. His pen paused. He glanced at her, then back at his work. Good. More silence. Eloan bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. I usually go to sleep around the 10th bell, she offered. Is that acceptable? Or would you prefer I stay awake until you retire because I can do that? I once stayed up for 2 straight days during a fever outbreak in the lower quarters, so I have some experience with not sleeping, although by the end I was seeing things that were definitely not there, and I called the stable master by his wife's name, which he did not appreciate. She was not happy about it either. Come to think of it. The king stared at her. His expression was unreadable, but a flicker behind his eyes shifted the set of his face. Surprise, perhaps. Or the realization that the person assigned to share his private chambers was incapable of silence. "The 10th bell is spine," he said slowly. "Right." Elowen nodded. "Good. Perfect." She busied herself arranging her bag, which contained exactly 3 items and did not require arranging. The king returned to his work. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks against the stone. When the 10th bell rang, low and resonant through the palace walls, Elowen changed behind the dressing screen into the simple cotton shift she had brought. She lay down on the cot, pulled the thin blanket to her chin, and stared at the ceiling. She could hear him across the room, the rustle of papers, the creak of his chair. The deep, measured breathing of a man who was fighting something she could not see. Occasionally she heard a low sound, almost a growl, quickly suppressed. The wolf testing its chains. Time passed. She did not know how much. The fire burned lower, the room dimmed from gold to amber to deep red, and then she heard it, the subtle shift. His breathing changed, deepened, lost the rigid control that had marked it all evening. The papers went quiet. The growl vanished. She turned her head carefully and saw that his head was resting on his folded arms, his pen still loosely held between his fingers, asleep at his desk, as though he had been drowning and had finally stopped fighting the current. An unfamiliar feeling twisted low in her stomach. Not pity exactly, closer to tenderness and dangerously near, and she remembered Marin's warning about feelings that didn't feel like her own. She lay in the dark and listened to him breathe, and wondered what it must be like to be so tired that even a curse could not keep you awake when the right person was near. It was a strange thought. She pushed it away and closed her eyes. In the morning she woke to find him gone. The desk was cleared, the chair pushed in, the fire freshly stoked on a small table beside her cot. Someone had placed a cup of tea that was still warm. Elowen stared at it for a long time. Then she picked it up with both hands, breathed in the steam, and felt something dangerous and lovely bloom behind her ribs. A rhythm formed over the following days, fragile at first, like a bridge built of rope, and faith over a chasm neither of them acknowledged. Each evening, Elowen arrived at the king's chambers after the palace had quieted. She set up her small corner of the room, the cot, the blanket, the bag, with her few belongings, and tried to make herself small. Each evening the king worked at his desk, ignoring her with such deliberate thoroughness that it became its own form of acknowledgement. You had to be aware of someone to ignore them that precisely. And each evening he fell asleep. Sometimes at his desk, pen still in hand, his forehead coming to rest on stacked documents that left faint ink marks on his skin. Sometimes on the settee by the fire, a book open on his chest, his head tipped back against the cushion. Once, memorably, standing by the window with his forehead pressed against the glass, she had watched him tilt slowly, degree by degree, his body surrendering to sleep like a fortress, giving up its walls one stone at a time. His shoulder hit the wall, and he slid to the floor without waking. She had crept over on bare feet and draped her blanket across his shoulders. Her fingers brushed his collarbone as she tucked the wool around him, and he had not stirred. But something in his face had shifted, the hard line of his mouth softened. The furrow between his brows eased. He looked younger in sleep, less like a king, more like a man. She had returned to her cot, and not slept for a very long time. In the mornings he was always gone before she woke. But the evidence of him remained in small, wordless gestures that accumulated like petals gathering at the base of a tree. The tea appeared every morning without fail. The first few cups were too strong, almost bitter, as if whoever made them did not understand the concept of gentleness. Then one morning it was perfect, sweetened with honey, steeped to exactly the color of autumn, and she knew he had been paying attention, not asking, not acknowledging, just quietly adjusting until he got it right. A second blanket appeared on her cot, thicker than the first, made of wool so soft it could only have come from the royal stores. She said nothing about it, neither did he. The flat pillow vanished overnight and was replaced by one that was actually comfortable, stuffed with down rather than straw. When she looked at the king the next evening, he was already working at his desk and did not look up. "Thank you for the pillow," she said. "I have no idea what you're referring to," Caleb replied, without lifting his pen. Elowen smiled into the collar of her nightgown and said nothing more about it. The silence between them began to change. It lost its sharp edges, its formality, its weight. It became something companionable, like a room that has been lived in long enough to feel warm. Something she began to look forward to in a way that confused her and that she suspected would terrify Marin. She could not help studying him during these quiet hours. The way he held his pen. 3 fingers along the shaft, thumb braced underneath, a grip that suggested someone had taught him calligraphy as a child, and the habit had never left. The way he rubbed the bridge of his nose when he was frustrated with a document. The way his mouth pressed into a hard line when he read something he disagreed with, and the way that same mouth softened when sleep finally took him, becoming something almost gentle. She noticed the shadows beneath his eyes, lighter now than the first night, but still present, like bruises that had faded from black to violet but refused to disappear entirely. She noticed the way his clothes hung looser than they should on a frame that large, the belt cinched 1 notch tighter than it had been designed for. She noticed the faint tremor in his hands that appeared late in the evening when his body was tired and his defenses low. The curse pressing against the edges of his control, like water testing a dam. She noticed far too much for someone who was supposed to be furniture. One evening he spoke first. This was unusual enough that Elowen nearly dropped her cup of tea, which she had taken to bringing with her because the evenings were long and the silence, while comfortable, occasionally needed company. "Marin tells me you were a foundling," he said, not looking up from his work. She tensed. "That's right. Left on the healer's doorstep, with nothing but a wool blanket and an inconvenient hair color. Yes." His pen paused. "Inconvenient. Have you ever tried to be invisible with red hair?" Elowen asked. "It doesn't work. Every mistake I've ever made has been witnessed and remembered because people can spot me from 3 rooms away. I could be standing behind a pillar, behind a curtain, behind another person, and someone would still see this." She tugged at her braid, "and know exactly who was responsible." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. A haunting. "I can see how that would be inconvenient." "It's a curse," she said, then caught herself. "Sorry, poor choice of words." This time, the shift was unmistakable. The corner of his mouth turned upward. Just barely, just enough to change the landscape of his face entirely. Elowen felt warmth bloom beneath her ribs and told herself firmly that it was the fire and nothing else. Over the next week the quiet conversations grew longer and more personal in ways that surprised them both. Never during the day, never in public. Only in the firelit privacy of his chambers, in the hours between her arrival and his surrender to sleep, she learned that he preferred his tea without sugar, but with a sprig of mint when it was available, that he could speak 4 languages and read 2 more, that his wolf before the curse had been coal-black and enormous even by alpha standards, and that he had once been proud of the beast in a way he could not afford to be now. In return, she told him about Marin's training, about the apprentice who had accidentally created a paste that turned everything it touched bright orange, including the apprentice herself, and how the stain had lasted for 2 weeks. The girl had walked around the palace looking like a sunset with legs, and even the palace cook had refused to serve her food in case the color was contagious. She told him about the time she had confused valerian root with a far less soothing herb and sent a guardsman into a 3-hour sneezing fit that had become a palace legend. The man still glared at her every time she passed the barracks. Was the guardsman angry? Caleb asked. Furious, Eloan said. But it's hard to be intimidating when you sneeze every 4 seconds. So I escaped with my dignity mostly intact, mostly. The sound he made was quiet, barely more than an exhale through his nose. But it was a laugh. She was certain of it. The first one she had ever heard from him, and the sound landed somewhere behind her ribs like a struck match and set a blaze that she did not know how to put out. "You're staring," the king said without looking at her. "I am not," she lied, looking away so quickly she nearly pulled a muscle in her neck. He made the sound again, quieter this time, almost private. She fell asleep smiling. Marin pulled her aside the following morning, her face carved from stone. "I need to tell you something," the healer said, closing the door to the workroom behind them. Eloan's stomach clenched. That tone never preceded good news. That tone preceded words like growth and malignant and, "I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do. Corwin has shared the latest reports with me. The curse is still advancing. The king's episodes are less frequent when you're near him, but they haven't stopped entirely. He had one yesterday afternoon while you were working in the storeroom." "How bad?" Eloan asked, her mouth suddenly dry. "He shattered a table in the war room with his bare hands. Corwin and 2 guards restrained him until it passed, but it took longer for the wolf to recede than it ever has before. He was gone for nearly 10 minutes. Eloan. The man was simply not there. Just the wolf." Eloan placed her hand against her sternum, where a heavy coldness had settled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your presence suppresses the curse at close range, but the moment you leave, it rebounds. The wolf gets more aggressive, not less, as if the curse is compensating for the ground it lost." Marin paused, choosing her next words with the care of a woman diffusing something volatile. "The healers and I have been consulting. We believe that sustained physical contact would have a stronger suppressive effect, not proximity." "Contact?" Eloan stared at her. "You want me to touch the king?" "I want you to consider sleeping closer to him." "Closer," Eloan repeated, her voice climbing, "as in his bed. You want me to sleep in the Alpha King's bed." "I want you to help him survive," Marin said plainly. "That is what I want." Eloan covered her face with both hands and breathed into them. "He'll refuse, probably," Marin agreed. "At least once." "At least once," Eloan echoed, her voice muffled by her hands. "Marin, this is the Alpha King. He doesn't even acknowledge me during daylight hours. I am furniture to him. Very useful, occasionally noisy furniture that he tolerates because it keeps his wolf from eating people." The healer gave her a long, knowing look that made Eloan feel like a page in a book that someone else had already read. "Is that really what you think?" Eloan did not answer, because the truth was more complicated than she wanted to admit. She knew what she was to him on paper. A remedy, a tool, a convenient biological quirk that suppressed his curse. But there was the tea, the pillow, the blanket, the almost laugh. There was the way his breathing changed the moment she entered the room, the tension leaving his body like a sail releasing wind. There was the way he said her name, low and careful, like he was learning a word in a language he had not spoken before and wanted to get the pronunciation exactly right. She did not know what any of it meant, but she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that it was not nothing. "I'll talk to him," Eloan said quietly. "Tonight." She did not talk to him that night, or the next. On the third evening, she nearly managed it, got as far as opening her mouth, before her courage abandoned her entirely, and she asked him about the weather instead. Caleb had looked at her with an expression that suggested he found the weather an unusual topic for someone sitting indoors. But he answered anyway. "It was raining, had been all day." "I know," Eloan said miserably. "I can hear it." He studied her for a moment, and she sensed him weighing the distance between the questions she had asked and the questions she had wanted to ask. But he said nothing more, and the moment passed, and she went to sleep on her cot, hating herself for her cowardice. On the fourth evening, Marin cornered her in the storeroom and told her, in a voice that left no room for negotiation, that the king had suffered 2 episodes in a single afternoon, and that the second one had lasted nearly 15 minutes. The guards were frightened. Corwin was barely holding the court together, and the king's wolf had started growling in his sleep, even with Elowin in the room, which meant the curse was adapting to proximity. Contact was no longer optional. "If you don't tell him tonight," Marin said, "I will tell him myself, and I promise you I will be less diplomatic about it." So that night, standing in the king's chambers with her hands twisted together and her heart lodged somewhere near her throat, Elowin said the words, "Marin says I need to sleep in your bed." The silence that followed was extraordinary. It had weight and texture and a faint electric quality, like the air before lightning strikes. Caleb set down his pen with careful deliberation. He turned in his chair and looked at her. Really looked at her the way he rarely did, with the full weight of his attention focused on her face. It was like standing in sunlight that was slightly too bright. "No," he said. "I thought you might say that. Then why did you ask?" "Because Marin told me to, and she's scarier than you are." Wry disbelief flickered in his expression. "I doubt that. You haven't seen her when an apprentice contaminates the wound salve. She once made a grown man cry, using only her eyebrows. The ghost of a smile crossed his face and vanished. The answer is still, no, Your Majesty," Elowin said, and she was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You had 2 episodes today. The curse is getting stronger. Being in the same room isn't enough anymore. Marin says the curse is adapting to proximity, and the only thing that might work is direct contact." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm asking to help you survive," she said, echoing Marin's words, because they were the truest ones she had. "That's all." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war behind his eyes. Pride against necessity, control against surrender. The desperate, exhausting need to appear strong against the simple, devastating truth that he was running out of time. "Fine," he said at last. The word sounded like it had been dragged out of him by force. "But you stay on your side, obviously, and this changes nothing." "Of course not," Elowin agreed, though her pulse was hammering in a way that suggested her body violently disagreed. Climbing into the king's bed felt like stepping off a cliff. The mattress was obscenely comfortable, thick and yielding in a way her cot had never been, and the sheets were smooth against her skin. She lay on the very edge, as far from the center as physics allowed without actually falling off, and stared at the canopy overhead. She could count the stitches in the embroidered fabric. She focused on that because focusing on anything else, like the fact that she could feel the heat of him radiating across the mattress, would be unwise. She heard him cross the room, heard the rustle of fabric as he removed his jacket. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the canopy and did not look. She heard the soft thud of boots being set aside, one and then the other. She heard the mattress dip as he lay down, felt the subtle shift of weight that confirmed he was there, 2 feet away, in the same bed, separated by an ocean of linen, and the absolute certainty that this was going to be a disaster. "You're breathing very loudly," he said into the dark. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Why?" "Because I've never shared a bed with anyone before, let alone a king, and I'm worried I'll do something embarrassing in my sleep, like talk or kick or steal all the blankets." "Do you normally do those things?" "I don't know. I've never had anyone there to tell me." A pause. Then, very quietly, "I won't judge you for stealing blankets." Elowin bit her lip against a smile. The fire crackled. The rain tapped against the windows in a rhythm that was almost musical. Slowly, gradually, the rigid tension in her body began to ease. His warmth reached her from across the mattress, a steady radiance that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with him. It pulled at her like a tide, subtle but relentless, and she let it carry her toward the edge of sleep. His breathing changed first, deepened. She turned her head and saw that his eyes were closed, his face slack, his body surrendering to sleep with a speed that made her breath catch. Not 20 minutes. Not 15. Within 5 minutes of lying beside her, the Alpha King was asleep. She lay awake much longer, listening to the rain and the fire and the sound of his breathing. Something was happening inside her that she could not name and could not stop. A warmth that started in her chest and spread outward like ink in water, settling into her bones, her blood, the quiet, unremarkable wolf inside her that had suddenly, inexplicably, stopped being quiet. Her wolf was pressing forward, straining toward him with a need that bordered on desperation. Not fear, not instinct, something else. Something that felt like recognition, like reunion. Like finding a piece of herself that she had not known was missing. Aloan closed her eyes and tried to ignore it. She failed. Sometime during the night, she woke to find that the distance between them had disappeared entirely. She was curled against his side, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder, one hand pressed flat against his chest directly over his heart. His arm was wrapped around her, heavy and warm, holding her against him with the unconscious possessiveness of a man who did not know he was doing it. His heartbeat pulsed beneath her palm, steady and slow and sure she should have moved. Should have pulled away and retreated to her side of the bed, and pretended this had never happened. But his wolf, the beast that terrorized the palace, the creature that had shredded tables and sent guards running, was utterly still beneath her touch. She could feel it through the bond that was forming between them, the bond she was not ready to name. The wolf was calm, content, at peace in a way that she suspected it had not been in a very long time. So she stayed. She closed her eyes and pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed him in and memorized the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her palm. In the morning, he was gone. But the pillow beside hers still held the impression of his head, and when she pressed her face into it, it smelled like him. Like cedar and iron and something warm beneath it all that she could not identify, but that made her wolf keen softly inside her chest. She was in so much trouble. The trouble got worse. Each night the distance between them shrank further, as if the bed itself was conspiring against them. She would fall asleep on her side and wake up tangled with him, her back against his chest, his face buried in her hair, their legs intertwined in ways that made her face burn when she became aware of them. He never acknowledged it in the mornings, neither did she. But the silences between them changed again, becoming charged with something that had teeth and weight and a pulse of its own. His wolf grew calmer each night, settling into a deep stillness that Aloan sensed along the invisible thread between them, like warm water pooling around her feet. But during the day, when she returned to the herbalist's quarters and the distance between them stretched, she could feel the curse pushing back. The tether between man and beast would strain, the wolf growing restless and agitated, and by afternoon the tremor in his hands would be visible from across the room. The curse was learning, adapting, treating her presence like a siege it needed to overcome. One evening she arrived to find him standing by the fire, his hands braced against the mantel, his head bowed. The tremor in his hands was worse than she had ever seen it. His knuckles were bone white, and the muscles in his forearms were jumping beneath the skin. "Your Majesty?" she asked carefully. "Don't," he said. His voice was strained, pulled taut like a wire about to snap. "Don't come closer." She stopped. The air in the room felt wrong, thick and pressurized, like the moment before a storm breaks. His wolf reached her through the half-formed bond, and what came through made her blood run cold. The beast was raging, throwing itself against the walls of its cage with a fury that shook the tether holding it to the man. The curse was wrapped around the wolf like a fist, squeezing, goading, driving it toward the surface with relentless force. "Calem," she said, and it was the first time she had ever used his name without his title. His head snapped toward her, his eyes were gold. The shift happened faster than she could process. One moment, he was a man gripping the mantle with white-knuckled hands. The next, he was something in between, his body contorting, bones cracking, and reshaping with sounds that were wet and terrible in the quiet room. He dropped to all fours, and the wolf surged forward with a snarl that shook the windows in their frames and sent a cascade of dust from the ceiling beams. Aloan did not run. She did not know why. Every rational thought in her head was screaming at her to get out, but her feet would not move, and her wolf, her small, unremarkable wolf, rose up inside her with a force that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. It rose up, and it howled. The sound that came out of her was not human. It was low and resonant and ancient, and it came from somewhere deeper than her throat, somewhere that had nothing to do with the quiet foundling girl she had always believed herself to be. It filled the room, it filled the corridor beyond, it filled the spaces between the stones and the gaps between heartbeats and the silence where the curse lived. The king's wolf froze, the snarl cut off like a severed rope. Those terrible golden eyes locked onto her, wide and stunned, and she watched the beast lower its massive head, press its muzzle against the stone floor, and go utterly still, submission complete and total. From the strongest wolf alive. To her, Eloin stood there shaking her hands, trembling at her sides, and felt a vast, unknowable force moving beneath the surface of her own skin. A power that had been sleeping her entire life and was now slowly beginning to wake. Her crimson hair felt warm against her shoulders, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire, and for just a moment, the strands seemed to glow. The shift reversed. Caleb came back to himself on his hands and knees, gasping, his body slicked with sweat, his shirt torn at the seams. He stayed like that for a long time, breathing in ragged bursts, his forehead pressed against the cold stone. When he finally raised his head and looked at her, the gold was gone. His eyes were dark again and full of something that looked like devastation. "What are you?" he whispered. "I don't know," she said, and it was the most honest answer she had ever given. He got to his feet, slowly, heavily, as though 10 years had passed in 10 minutes. She watched him brace himself against the wall, watched the effort it took him to stand upright, and she moved toward him without thinking. Her hand reached for his arm. "Don't touch me." The words came out harsh, jagged, edged with a pain that had nothing to do with anger. She flinched back like she had been struck. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You need to leave." He would not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, on the claw marks his wolf had left in a stone. "Caleb, please. You saw what just happened." His voice was raw, stripped bare. "My wolf nearly took over completely, and you were in the room. If I had lost control for one more second, if whatever you did hadn't worked, I would have torn you apart without even knowing your name. But you didn't," she insisted, her voice rising. "You stopped. Your wolf submitted to me." "That's exactly the problem." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. Cold, controlled, deliberately empty, like a house whose occupant had locked every door and shuttered every window. "I don't know what you are, but you're making it worse. The curse is feeding off whatever connection is forming between us. The more I need you, the harder it fights when you're not there. Then I'll stay," she said. "I'll stay all the time. I won't leave your side. You're an herbalist," he said, and each word fell like a stone dropped into deep water. "A foundling with no name and no bloodline. You are not my equal. You are not my mate. And you cannot save me from this." The words hit her in the center of her chest, and she felt a fracture open inside her, a hairline crack that ran from her throat to the base of her spine. He did not mean them. She sensed it through the bond that was fraying between them, sensed the agony behind the cruelty, the desperate self-destruction of a man trying to push away the only thing keeping him alive because he could not bear the thought of dragging her down with him. But knowing he did not mean them did not make them hurt any less. "You're right," she said, and her voice was very calm in a way that frightened her. "I am nobody, I've always been nobody, but you were sleeping. For the first time in 2 years you were sleeping, and I was the reason. Do with that what you will, your majesty." She turned and walked out of his chambers. Her spine was straight, her chin was lifted. Her vision was blurring with tears. She refused to let fall until the door closed behind her. In the corridor, she leaned her back against the cold stone wall and slid to the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees and pressed her forehead against them and broke apart as quietly as she could. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. Without Eloin in his chambers, Caleb stopped sleeping entirely. Corwin reported that the episodes were coming daily now. Sometimes twice a day the king's wolf was clawing its way to the surface with increasing violence, and each time it took longer for the man to come back. Guards who had served the crown for decades requested transfers. Servants avoided the king's wing entirely. Whispers spread through the court like smoke, and the word that kept surfacing in those whispers was the one everyone feared most: feral. Eloin felt it too, though she tried to pretend she did not. The half-formed bond between them, incomplete and aching, pulled at her constantly like a fishhook lodged beneath her ribs. She couldn't eat. Food turned to ash in her mouth. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she reached for warmth that was not there. The migraines came first, blinding and relentless, forcing her to work in near darkness with the curtains drawn. Then the nausea. Then the trembling in her hands that mirrored his, as if the bond was transmitting his deterioration directly into her body. Her wolf was frantic inside her, pacing and howling and clawing at the walls of her chest with increasing desperation. It wanted him, needed him. And with every hour that passed, the need grew sharper and more agonizing, like a blade being slowly turned. On the 5th day, Marin found her collapsed on the floor of the storeroom, unconscious, surrounded by shattered glass and the sharp, sweet smell of spilled tinctures. She woke in the infirmary. The light was too bright. Everything hurt. "Easy," Marin said, pressing her back down with firm hands. "Don't try to sit up." "What happened?" Eloin's voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone at the other end of a long corridor. "You fainted. Knocked an entire shelf of tinctures off the wall on your way down. Quite a mess." Marin's tone was dry, but her hands were shaking, and that was what frightened Eloin most. Marin's hands never shook. "Eloin, how long has this been going on? The headaches, the trembling, the weight loss? How long?" "I'm fine," she lied. "You are dying," Marin said. And the flatness of it, the complete absence of softness or gentleness, was more terrifying than any raised voice could have been. "The bond between you and the king is incomplete. It's pulling you apart from the inside. Your wolf is trying to reach him and failing, and the effort is destroying your body." Eloin closed her eyes. "He sent me away. I know what he did," Marin's voice hardened. "And I know why he did it. The stubborn, self-sacrificing fool thinks he's protecting you by killing you both slowly instead of letting the curse kill him quickly." "Maybe he is right," Eloin whispered. "Maybe I should just let him go." "You can't let him go," Marin said. "That's what you haven't understood yet. The bond is not a choice, it is a fact. You can ignore it the same way you can ignore gravity, which is to say you can try, but the ground will find you eventually." The infirmary door burst open. Corwin strode in, and behind him, filling the doorway like a storm-given form, was Caleb. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened into hollows that looked carved by something cruel. His cheekbones stood out sharply, the flesh beneath them worn away by days without sleep or food or peace. His hands were clenched at his sides, and she could see the faint gold flicker in his irises that meant the wolf was dangerously close to the surface. But it was his face when he saw her that undid her. The mask cracked. The cold, controlled emptiness he had worn when he sent her away shattered like thin ice over dark water, and what was underneath was raw and ragged and utterly wrecked. Eloan, her name came out broken, cracked down the middle. Your Majesty, she managed, trying to sit up. I'm fine. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside her bed. His hands hovered over her, trembling violently, wanting to touch her but not daring to. She could see the muscle in his jaw working, could see the tears he was fighting back with everything he had. I did this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I did this to you. You were trying to protect me, she said. I was wrong. The words came out like they cost him everything he had left. His hand found hers and gripped it, and the moment their skin touched, she felt the bond flare between them like a match struck in a dark room. Her wolf surged forward with a cry of relief that resonated through every cell in her body. His eyes closed, the gold in his irises faded to nothing, the tension in his shoulders released like a fist unclenching. And for the first time in 5 days, the wolf inside him went quiet. Please, he whispered, pressing her hand against his cheek. His skin was rough with days of stubble and warm and real. Don't leave me again. Behind them, Marin cleared her throat. Now that we've established that separating them is a death sentence for both. The healer said, with the calm authority of a woman who had been right all along and was too professional to gloat about it. Perhaps your Majesty would like to hear what I found in the restricted archives last night. Marin spread the ancient text across the infirmary table, handling the brittle pages with the reverence of someone who understood that some books were older than the kingdom itself. The leather binding was cracked and faded, the ink inside a deep rust color that Eloin tried not to think about too closely because it looked unsettlingly like dried blood. The Crimson Luna, Marin read, her finger tracing the old script with practiced care. Born once in 1,000 years. Hair the color of burning embers, a wolf that sleeps until it is called, and a howl that can reach across the veil between life and death. Eloin felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Calum had gone rigid, his hand still gripping hers. The texts describe a wolf whose very essence opposes corruption, Marin continued, her voice measured and deliberate. Blood curses, death magic, anything designed to sever or destroy the bond between wolf and man. The Crimson Luna's power is the antithesis of these forces. Her presence alone can suppress cursed magic. Her touch can quiet the most feral beast, and her bond, once completed, can break a blood curse entirely. The silence in the room was absolute, even the fire seemed to have stopped crackling. That's a fairy tale, Eloin said. Her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. Every pup in the realm has heard that story. It's told to children at bedtime to make them feel safe. Most legends begin as truth, Marin replied evenly. The details get distorted over centuries, embellished and simplified until they sound like fiction. But the core remains. She turned the page with careful fingers, revealing an illustration that made Eloin's breath catch. A woman with crimson hair standing before a massive wolf, her hand on its bowed head, her eyes lit with golden fire. The last documented Crimson Luna appeared over 900 years ago. She was a foundling, an orphan of unknown origin, with red hair and an unremarkable wolf that showed no signs of power until she encountered a cursed alpha. Eloin's hands had begun to shake. That doesn't mean it's me. Crimson hair, Marin counted on her fingers. Foundling of unknown origin. A wolf that has been dormant your entire life until you enter the presence of a cursed alpha king, at which point it responded with a power that made his wolf submit completely. She paused and looked at Eloin over the top of the ancient page. Tell me which part doesn't fit. All of it, Eloin whispered. I'm not a legend, I'm just me. Calum had not spoken. She turned to look at him and found him staring at her with an expression that mixed wonder and horror in equal measure. The horror was not directed at her, It was directed entirely and devastatingly at himself. "I turned you away," he said, his voice hollow. "I called you nobody? You didn't know?" Elowyn started. "I called you nobody," he repeated, and the self-loathing in his voice was so sharp she could almost see it cutting him open from the inside. The one person in 1,000 years who could break this curse, who was meant to break this curse. And I looked her in the eyes and told her she was nothing. Caleb. She reached for him. He pulled away, standing abruptly, the chair scraping against stone, with a sound that made everyone flinch. "I need air, Your Majesty." Corwin stepped forward, but Caleb was already moving toward the door, his strides long and rigid, with barely contained self-destruction. "Let him go," Marin said quietly. "He needs to sit with this." The door closed behind him, and the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor until the silence swallowed them whole. Elowyn stared at the empty doorway. A cold resolve settled at her core, replacing the warmth of the bond with the harder substance of resolve. She had spent her entire life waiting for permission. Permission to exist, permission to matter, permission to take up space. She was done waiting. She looked at Corwin. Where will he go? The beta studied her with an expression she could not entirely read. The North Tower. He always goes there when the world becomes too much. Then that's where I'm going. He won't want to see you right now, Corwin warned. I don't care what he wants, Elowyn said, swinging her legs off the infirmary bed. Her body protested, every muscle aching, her head swimming with residual dizziness. She ignored it all. He has spent 2 years trying to handle this curse alone. He has pushed away everyone who tried to help him. He drove me out of his chambers because he thought he was protecting me, and it nearly killed us both. She stood swaying slightly, and Marin steadied her with a firm grip on her elbow. I refuse to let him decide what I can survive, Elowyn said. Corwin and Marin exchanged a look. The beta's mouth twitched with what might have been admiration. The North Tower stairs are steep, he said. Take the servants' passage on the left. It's shorter. She found him on the tower's upper landing, silhouetted against a sky that was turning from gray to violet as the last light bled from the horizon. The wind pulled at his hair and flattened his shirt against his back, and he stood at the edge of the parapet looking out at the kingdom he was slowly losing the ability to rule. He heard her coming. She knew because his shoulders stiffened and his hands gripped the stone rail until his knuckles went white. But he did not turn. I told you I needed air, he said, and I told you I am done letting you push me away. She crossed the landing and stopped beside him. The wind caught her braid and whipped it sideways, the crimson vivid against the darkening sky, like a banner declaring something she was only beginning to understand. His wolf reached for her along the tether that joined them, restless and aching, straining toward her with a need that mirrored her own. You called me nobody, she said, and her voice was steady, a foundling with no name and no bloodline, and you were right about the facts. I was left on a doorstep. I have no family, I have no rank. I have spent my entire life trying to be useful enough to justify the air I breathe and the space I occupy. She turned to face him. But you were wrong about what it means. I am not nobody. I have never been nobody. And even before Marin found that book, even before anyone whispered the word legend, I was enough. I was enough to make your wolf stop. I was enough to give you sleep when nothing and no one else could. I was enough to make you laugh. I was enough to make you leave a cup of tea beside my bed every single morning and pretend you hadn't. Her voice cracked. But she kept going because she was afraid that if she stopped, she would never start again. You did not reject a legend, Caleb, you rejected me. And I am standing here anyway. Not because a prophecy told me to. Not because your beta commanded it. Not because some ancient book says I'm special. Because you are worth fighting for, and I refuse to let you die believing that you're not. He turned to face her. The wind died. The world narrowed to the space between them. the 2 feet of cold stone and charged air that had become the most significant distance in the kingdom. "I don't deserve you," he said. "That's not your decision to make," she replied. He closed the distance. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a tenderness that contradicted the size and strength of him. And he looked at her with eyes that held no gold, no wildness, nothing but a devastating, unguarded love that made her chest ache so beautifully. "I'm sorry," he said, "for every word I said that night, for every day you spent in pain because I was too afraid to let you close, for calling you nobody when you are the only person who has ever made me feel like someone worth saving." "You're an idiot," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed. "Completely," she kissed him, rose up on her toes and pressed her mouth to his with all the longing and fury and love that had been building inside her since the first night she watched him fall asleep at his desk with ink on his fingers and silver in his hair. He responded, like a dam breaking his arms, wrapped around her, pulling her against him until there was no space left between them. And the kiss deepened into something fierce and desperate and consuming. The bond between them blazed. She felt it ignite in her chest, a golden thread pulling taut and locking into place, connecting them at a depth that went beyond skin and blood and bone. Her wolf howled inside her, not with pain, but with triumph, with recognition, with the ancient, unshakable certainty that this was right, that this had always been right. He lifted her off her feet, and she rocked herself around him, and together they stumbled through the tower door and down the narrow passage that led to his chambers. The journey was a blur of heated kisses and breathless laughter and whispered apologies, and his hands in her hair and her hands on his chest, and neither of them willing to break contact for even a second. In his chambers, he laid her down on the bed that had once terrified her and looked at her with a question in his eyes. She answered by pulling him closer. What followed was everything she had imagined, and nothing she could have prepared for. Tender and fierce and overwhelming all at once, the bond deepened with every touch, every whispered word, every breath that echoed off the stone walls. When the mating bite came, his teeth sinking into the curve of her neck with a groan that vibrated through her entire body, the bond locked into place with a force that stole her breath and filled her vision with gold. She bit him back, claimed him the way he had claimed her, marking his skin with her teeth, and feeling his answering shudder against her mouth. The bond completed itself with a sound she felt rather than heard, a deep, resonant hum that settled into her bones, like a song she had always known, but never been able to remember. They lay together afterward in the tangled sheets, his arms around her, her head on his chest, their breathing slowly returning to something resembling normal. The bond laid him bare to her, his heartbeat, his relief, his staggering, desperate, overwhelming love for her that he had been fighting since the first moment she walked through his door with a basket of chamomile and not enough sense to run. "I love you," she said. Because it was true and because she was tired of not saying true things. His arms tightened around her. "I have loved you since the night you thanked me for a pillow I did not give you," she laughed. And the sound was watery and bright, and full of a joy that felt too large for her body to contain. He fell asleep with her in his arms, and she watched his face go peaceful in the firelight, and felt for the first time in her life that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not on the margins, not in the edges, not trying to make herself small enough to be forgiven for existing here in the center, held. She closed her eyes, and sleep took her gently, and she opened them in the fog. The fog was not fog. It was alive, possessed of intent and appetite, pressing against her skin like cold hands searching for a way inside. It moved with a patience that made her stomach turn, curling around her ankles, rising up her calves, pulling at the hem of her nightgown with fingers that were not there. The air smelled of ash and old blood and the particular kind of silence that exists in places where terrible things have happened and the ground itself remembers. Eloan's bare feet met earth that was soft and wrong beneath her, yielding too much, like soil that had been freshly turned over a grave. Trees surrounded her, but they were not trees. They were too tall, too black, their branches bare and twisted into shapes that looked deliberate, intentional, like something had arranged them to resemble a forest, while having no understanding of what a forest was supposed to feel like. "Caleb," she called. Her voice came out thin and muffled, swallowed by the fog before it traveled more than a few feet. The bond in her chest pulled tight, a golden thread stretched to its limit, and she followed it. She found him in a clearing. He was on his knees, his head bowed, his hands flat against the dark ground. Around him, in a circle that tightened with every breath, walked wolves, dozens of them. Their fur was matted with blood that never dried, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical and wrong, like creatures trapped in a pattern they could not break. Some of them bore wounds that would never close, scars that would never fade, damage that should have ended them. They walked anyway, circling, circling, always circling, and standing at the center of the circle, directly before Caleb, was a woman. She was tall and thin, with black hair that hung in lank curtains around a face that might once have been beautiful. Dark runes were branded into her arms, still glowing with the magic she had used to fuel the curse. Shadows bled from her fingers onto the earth, and where they fell, the ground turned black and cracked. Sereth, or what the curse had made of her memory. The witch smiled when she saw Eloan. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator that had been waiting. "There she is," Sereth said, and her voice was layered, echoing, as though many people were speaking at once through her throat. "The Crimson Girl, come to save her king Caleb." Eloan stepped forward, but the wolf shifted, tightening their circle, blocking her path. The curse hung in the air, thick and oily, coating her lungs with every breath. "Caleb, look at me." He did not raise his head. The bond showed her what held him there, not chains, not magic, something worse. Agreement, he believed. He belonged here. "He came to my lands with fire," Sereth said, circling behind Caleb with the slow deliberateness of a predator that knew its prey could not run. "He came with an army and a righteous cause, and he burned everything I loved to the ground. My mate, my sons, my pack. He called it justice." "Valdric was killing innocent people," Eloan said, her voice shaking but her feet steady. "Your mate raided border settlements. He murdered civilians." "And your king murdered mine," Sereth replied. "And then he came for the rest of us, every wolf in Greymark, every elder, every mother, every child who did not run fast enough." Her smile widened, splitting her face in ways that geometry should not have allowed. "He is a beast. He has always been a beast. The curse simply reveals what was already there." Eloan looked at Caleb. His hands were curled into fists against the dark earth, and she understood the truth of what the curse was doing to him. It was not creating guilt from nothing. It was taking the guilt that already existed, the genuine, agonizing remorse of a man who had done terrible things in service of necessary ones, and feeding it until it consumed everything else, every good deed buried, every peaceful intention erased until all that remained was the violence played on an endless loop inside his own mind. "Is she right?" Eloan asked him quietly. He flinched. The bond carried it to her like a knife. "I gave the order," he said, his voice barely audible. "At Greymark, when the walls fell, I ordered the advance. I knew there were civilians inside. I knew, and I gave the order anyway, because Valdric was using them as shields, and every day we waited more people died in the borderlands." His shoulders shook. "I chose who lived and who died. I chose wrong." "You chose impossible," Eloan said. She dropped to her knees in front of him, ignoring the wolves that snapped and snarled at her back. "There was no right choice. There was only the least terrible one, and you made it, and it cost you everything, and you have been paying for it every single night since." "Not enough," he whispered. "Says who?" Eloan's voice rose. She gestured at the specter of Surath. A curse built from blood magic and vengeance. She doesn't want justice, Calum. She wants you to suffer forever. And you've been letting her have it because some part of you thinks you deserve it. The wolves tightened their circle. The fog thickened. Sirath's smile remained fixed and terrible. You think you're a beast, Eloan continued. And now she was crying, tears cutting hot lines down her cheeks. You think the wolf inside you is proof that you were always a monster? But I have slept beside that wolf. I have felt him go still under my hand. I have listened to him breathe in the dark, and he is not a monster. He is a wounded creature who has been told he is dangerous so many times that he started to believe it. She took his face in her hands and forced him to look at her. I know something about that, she said, her voice breaking. About being told you are nothing until you believe it. About spending your whole life trying to earn the right to exist. I was left on a doorstep as a baby, and I grew up believing I was abandoned because something was wrong with me. Because I was too much or not enough or simply not worth keeping. Tears dripped from her chin onto his hands. But that was a lie. It was always a lie. And this? She looked around at the dark forest, the circling wolves, the bleeding witch. This is a lie too. You are not a beast. You are a man who went to war to protect his people, and it broke you, and you deserve to heal. You deserve to put this down, Surath hissed. The sound was sharp and venomous, and the fog surged forward like a wave. She cannot save you, the witch snarled at Calum. No one can undo what you did. The dead do not forgive. The dead are not here, Eloan said, her voice suddenly steady. A force was building inside her, rising up from the deepest part of her chest where her wolf had been sleeping for 22 years. These are not your dead, Calum. These are your fears wearing their faces, and they only have power because you keep feeding them. The golden warmth that had been building inside her crested like a wave. She felt her wolf rise up, not small, not quiet, not unremarkable. Vast, ancient, blazing, with a light that turned her vision to amber and gold. Her hair, her impossible, inconvenient crimson hair, ignited, not with flame, but with radiance. A deep, burning glow that pushed the fog back and made the shadow wolves flinch and scatter. The howl that tore from her throat was nothing like the sound she had made in his chambers. That had been a reflex. This was a declaration. It rang through the dark forest like a bell made of starlight, shattering the silence the curse had built, reaching into every corner of the fog-shrouded prison and filling it with warmth, one by one, then all at once breaking apart into motes of gray light that drifted upward and vanished. The bleeding witch screamed, a sound of pure fury that cracked the dark trees down their centers, and Eloin watched the specter of Sereth fracture like glass, splitting into shards that scattered into the disintegrating fog. The black earth beneath them turned to soil, real soil. The twisted trees straightened. And then they too faded. The sky above them lightened from black to charcoal to silver, and then there was nothing left but open space and clean air and silence that was no longer oppressive, but simply quiet. Calum collapsed forward into her arms. She caught him, held him against her as the 2 years of guilt and grief and sleepless agony broke open inside him like a wound that had finally been lanced. He did not cry quietly. The sound that came from him was raw and animal and wrenching, the sound of a man who had been carrying the weight of the dead for so long that releasing it felt like losing a limb. "I've got you," she whispered against his hair. "I've got you. It's over." His arms tightened around her, pulling her so close his heartbeat hammered against her own. The bond between them hummed, warm and golden and steady as a heartbeat, and she felt the last tendrils of the curse loosen and fall away like chains dissolving into rust. Alone woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm amber light of a fire that had burned down to embers. Calum was awake beside her, looking down at her with eyes that were dark and clear and wet. He was smiling, small and fragile and real. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away tears she had not realized were there, and whispered, "Thank you." She rested her forehead against his and breathed him in and said nothing at all, because some things were too large for words and too important to diminish by trying. They held each other until the dawn came. The curse did not vanish, like a nightmare forgotten upon waking. It faded the way all deep wounds fade, slowly, unevenly, leaving scars that ached on cold mornings and memories that surfaced without warning. Caleb still had difficult nights. He would wake gasping, sometimes reaching for her in the dark, and she would be there, always there. She would press her palm against his chest and murmur his name until the tension left his shoulders and his breathing steadied, and the wolf inside him settled back into the calm, golden stillness that had become its natural state. The court's reaction to a foundling herbalist, as the Alpha King's Luna, was precisely what Eloan had expected. Whispers trailed her like shadows. Nobles who had never spoken to her before suddenly had opinions about bloodlines and propriety and the sacred traditions of the crown. A duchess called her the king's little stray at a formal dinner, loudly enough for the entire table to hear. Caleb had set down his wineglass very slowly and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "The woman you are referring to broke a blood curse that had defeated every healer, scholar, and witch in 3 territories. She did it by being braver than anyone in this room, myself included. You will address her as your queen." The Duchess had not spoken again for the rest of the evening, or the following one. On their wedding day, Elowen stood before the court in a gown she had never imagined wearing and tried not to feel like the foundling girl with the inconvenient hair. Caleb held her hand through the entire ceremony, his grip warm and sure, his voice unwavering when he spoke his vows. "They'll adjust," he murmured against her temple afterward, pulling her close in the privacy of their chambers. "And those who don't can take it up with their king, who happens to be irrevocably, unreasonably, and permanently devoted to his Luna." Now, months later, Elowen woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains of the chamber that had become theirs. Caleb was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful, his breathing deep and even. One arm was wrapped around her waist, his hand spread possessively across her stomach where new life had just begun to make itself known. He did not know yet. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell him. No nightmares. No golden eyes in the dark, no fog waiting to drag him under. She watched him sleep, her crimson hair spilling across the pillow they shared, and felt the bond hum between them, warm and steady and unbreakable. The legend and the king, the foundling and the wolf. 2 people who had been told they were not enough and had chosen to believe otherwise. Elowen smiled, settled back against his shoulder, and closed her eyes. They slept.